A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
If you have ever been in a medical emergency, you know that time is the only currency that matters. Every second of delay is a percentage point of survival ticking away. In the world of emergency medicine, we talk about the golden hour, that critical window where intervention can actually make the difference between life and death. But in Israel, they have taken that window and smashed it down to something much smaller. They call it the 3-minute gap.
It is the ultimate logistical challenge. How do you get a trained professional and a life-saving kit through gridlocked urban traffic to a person whose heart has just stopped? Most countries have a single, state-mandated answer to that. You call a 3-digit number and a government-funded ambulance shows up. Eventually. But in Israel, the answer is a strange, overlapping, and sometimes contentious patchwork of organizations that seem like they should not work together, yet somehow they produce some of the fastest response times in the world.
Today's prompt from Daniel is about why Israel does things differently. It is about the dual-track emergency response system that exists there, where you have the state-mandated Magen Adom and the community-based United Hatzalah operating side by side. It is a system built on a foundation of technology, religious mandates, and a massive influx of global philanthropy. It is honestly one of the most fascinating examples of decentralized infrastructure we have ever looked at.
I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been digging into the operational mechanics of this all week. It is now March of 2026, and looking back at how this system has evolved, especially after the massive stress tests of the last few years, it is clear that this is not just a story about ambulances. It is a story about how a society organizes itself for survival when the state's capacity reaches its limit.
Let's start with the players. Most people recognize the Red Cross or the Red Crescent. In Israel, that role is filled by Magen Adom, or MDA. They are the official national emergency medical, disaster, ambulance, and blood bank service. They were established in 1930, well before the state itself, and they were formalized under the MDA law in 1950.
They are the heavy hitters, corn. If you need a mobile intensive care unit, a neonatal transport, or a mass-scale blood transfusion, you are looking at MDA. But the interesting part is that even though they are the statutory body, they are not actually a government department. They are a national society, similar to how the American Red Cross operates. They get some government funding, but they rely heavily on service fees and donations. For decades, they were the only game in town. But as the population boomed and cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem became some of the most congested places on Earth, the centralized model started to show cracks.
And that is where United Hatzalah enters the frame. This is where the friction begins. Hatzalah, which means rescue in Hebrew, started as a grassroots volunteer network. It was founded in 2006 by Eli Beer with a very specific observation. Ambulances are too big for narrow, crowded streets. If a person collapses in the middle of a market in Jerusalem, an ambulance might be 5 minutes away, but it will take 10 minutes to park and get to the patient.
That gap is where people die. United Hatzalah's solution was radical decentralization. Instead of waiting for a central station to dispatch a vehicle, they equipped thousands of volunteers with medical kits and, most famously, ambucycles. These are heavy-duty motorcycles, usually 3-wheeled for stability, outfitted with almost everything an ambulance carries except the stretcher. We are talking about defibrillators, oxygen, trauma kits, the works.
I have seen those things weaving through traffic in videos. They are incredibly nimble, but the tech behind the dispatch is what really caught my eye. It is not just about having bikes. It is about knowing where every single volunteer is at every single second.
They use something called Life Compass technology. It is a high-precision GPS-based dispatch system that is essentially the Uberization of emergency medicine. When an emergency is reported, the system identifies the 5 closest volunteers to the scene, regardless of whether they are on duty. They could be at work, at a grocery store, or at home. Their phone pings with a specific high-pitched alert, they grab their kit, jump on their ambucycle, and they are often there in under 90 seconds.
90 seconds. That is faster than you can even finish a phone call with a traditional dispatcher in some countries. But Herman, this creates a weird institutional tension, right? If I am a state-mandated organization like MDA, and I have this massive overhead of stations and full-time staff, how do I feel about a volunteer organization showing up to my calls?
The friction has been intense for nearly 2 decades. For a long time, there was a massive fight over the dispatch data. If someone calls the national emergency number, which is 101 in Israel, that call goes to MDA. For years, MDA was reluctant to share that real-time data with United Hatzalah. Their argument was about patient privacy and quality control. They wanted to ensure that the people responding were fully integrated into their chain of command and held to the same medical standards.
But from Hatzalah's perspective, that looks like a monopoly on life-saving information. If you have a volunteer 2 doors down from a cardiac arrest and you do not tell them because they are not on your payroll, that feels like a moral failure. It is the classic battle between a centralized authority and a disruptive, decentralized startup.
There was actually a health ministry directive in 2017 that tried to force cooperation. It mandated a unified dispatch system where MDA would have to pass information to Hatzalah volunteers. It has been a rocky road, though. There have been court cases, public PR battles, and even legislative debates in the Knesset. Even now, in 2026, while the coordination is better, there is still a sense of competition. They are literally racing each other to the scene.
It is also a case of completely different funding models. MDA charges for ambulance rides. If you get picked up, you get a bill, though it is often covered by insurance. United Hatzalah is entirely free. They do not charge the patient to send. Which brings us to the second part of Daniel's prompt, the role of the Jewish diaspora. Herman, the sheer amount of money flowing from places like New York, Miami, and London into these organizations is staggering.
It is the lifeblood of the system. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars annually. United Hatzalah's budget is almost entirely donor-funded, and a huge chunk of that comes from outside Israel. This creates what I call a shadow infrastructure. You have a national emergency service that is being supplemented and sometimes outpaced by private donations from another country.
Why does that matter from a policy perspective? Well, it means the Israeli taxpayer is getting a world-class emergency response system for a fraction of the cost. But it also means the state does not have full control over its own emergency architecture. If those donations dried up tomorrow, the response times in Israel would plummet.
It is a non-dependency issue that we have touched on before in different contexts, like in episode 474. When a nation relies on external philanthropy for critical infrastructure, it creates a unique kind of vulnerability. But in this case, the bond between the diaspora and these organizations is so deep and so tied to religious and cultural values that it has remained remarkably stable.
There is also a competitive aspect to the fundraising that is very specific to this culture. You will see an ambulance or an ambucycle with a plaque saying it was donated by a specific family in New Jersey or a synagogue in London. It is a way for the diaspora to feel physically present in the defense and care of the country. It is not just sending money to a general fund. It is buying a specific piece of equipment that will save a specific life. It is tangible.
And that competition extends to the specialized organizations too. We have to talk about the second layer of this patchwork, Zaka. Their full name is Zikawi Korbanot Asin, which means Identification of Disaster Victims. They are a volunteer organization that responds to terror attacks, accidents, and natural disasters. But their mission is very specific and, to be honest, quite heavy. They ensure that human remains are handled with the utmost dignity according to Jewish law.
This is a crucial part of the patchwork that often gets overlooked. After a suicide bombing or a mass casualty event, Zaka volunteers are the ones who stay behind to collect every drop of blood and every piece of tissue for burial. It is a role that the state police or medical services are not necessarily equipped or religiously mandated to do with that level of granularity. It is based on the concept of chesed shel emet, or true kindness, because it is a favor done for someone who can never repay you.
Again, it is a volunteer-led, donor-funded organization filling a gap that the state cannot or will not fill. When you look at the response to the events of October 7, 2023, you see the full complexity of this system in action. Both MDA and United Hatzalah were on the front lines, often under fire.
That was the ultimate stress test. You had MDA ambulances being targeted and destroyed, and you had Hatzalah volunteers rushing into active combat zones on their motorcycles to treat wounded soldiers and civilians before the military medevacs could even get there. It was a moment where the institutional friction mostly melted away, because the scale of the crisis was so overwhelming.
But even then, the logistics were a nightmare. On October 7th, the centralized dispatch systems were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of calls. In many cases, it was the decentralized nature of the volunteers, people who lived in the kibbutzim and towns being attacked, who were the only ones able to provide care for hours. They were using WhatsApp groups and personal connections to coordinate because the main grid was under such strain.
We talked about the logistics of moving hospitals in episode 935, but this was the opposite. It was about decentralized units making life or death decisions in a total information vacuum. It really highlights the resilience of a patchwork system. If you have one single point of failure, a massive attack can take you offline. If you have 10,000 independent nodes with medical kits, you are much harder to shut down.
Most efficiency experts would look at this and say it is wasteful. You have redundant dispatch systems, redundant training programs, and redundant equipment. If you merged MDA and Hatzalah, you could save a fortune on overhead. You wouldn't have two different organizations buying two different sets of software or two different fleets of vehicles.
But would you save more lives? That is the counter-argument. The redundancy is the resilience. If MDA's dispatch system goes down, Hatzalah is still there. If a road is blocked for a four-wheeled ambulance, a bike gets through. In a country that faces constant security threats, a single point of failure is a luxury they cannot afford. The waste is actually a buffer. It is a feature, not a bug.
And we see this in the specialized response units too. Beyond Zaka, you have organizations like Yad Sarah, which provides home medical equipment for free. Again, donor-funded, volunteer-run. It creates a culture where the community feels responsible for the health of the neighbor, rather than just waiting for the government to fix it. It feels very aligned with a conservative worldview of civil society, the idea that the most effective solutions come from the bottom up.
But it does raise questions about accountability. If a volunteer makes a mistake, who is liable? If a donor-funded organization decides to stop serving a certain neighborhood because they ran out of money or volunteers there, what recourse is there?
There have been some issues with that. There was a lot of debate about how these organizations interact with the Arab-Israeli community, for example. To their credit, both MDA and United Hatzalah have made massive efforts to recruit Arab volunteers and station units in Arab towns. Hatzalah even has a dedicated United Hatzalah of the East branch in East Jerusalem. They realized that if their goal is speed, they need people who live in those neighborhoods and know the alleys.
It is a fascinating bit of social engineering. You have these ultra-Orthodox Jewish volunteers and secular Arab volunteers working together on the same dispatch app because they both care about the same 3-minute response time. It is one of the few places in that region where the common goal of survival actually bridges the political and religious divide.
The technical baseline for all of this is something we covered back in episode 542, looking at how emergency dispatch works globally. But Israel has taken that baseline and added this layer of crowdsourcing. It is almost like the Uberization of emergency medicine.
I can hear the skeptics already. Do we really want our life-saving care to be Uberized? But when you look at the data, the results are hard to argue with. In many parts of Israel, the response time for a first responder is under 3 minutes. In many major U.S. cities, you are lucky if an ambulance gets there in 10. And as you said earlier, Herman, 10 minutes is often too late for a stroke or a cardiac arrest. The brain starts to die after 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen.
If you do not have someone there with an AED or a bag valve mask in that window, the best hospital in the world cannot save you. So, looking forward to the rest of 2026 and beyond, the big question is, how does this model evolve? We are seeing more AI integration in the dispatch side now.
Tell me about that. How does AI change the dynamic between these two groups?
AI is the perfect tool for this kind of decentralized model. Right now, the dispatch systems are good at finding the closest person, but they are not always great at predicting where the next emergency will happen. If you can use historical data and real-time events, like a protest, a holiday, or even weather patterns, to pre-position ambucycles in the neighborhoods most likely to have a call, you could push that 90-second response time even lower.
It also might force a merger of data, if not organizations. An AI model is only as good as the data it has. If the data is split between two systems, the predictions will be less accurate. There is a strong technical argument for a single data lake for all emergency calls in the country, even if the responders come from different organizations.
That is where the politics gets tricky. Data is power. MDA views their call data as a strategic asset. Hatzalah views it as a public good. It is the same battle we see in big tech every day, but with much higher stakes.
It is also worth considering the guns versus butter debate we had in episode 548. Israel spends a massive portion of its budget on defense by allowing the diaspora to fund the butter side of things. The emergency medical services. The state can keep its focus on the guns. It is a way of outsourcing the welfare state to the global community.
It is a brilliant bit of fiscal management if you can pull it off, but it requires a very specific set of circumstances. You need a highly motivated diaspora, a culture of volunteerism, and a legal framework that allows these organizations to operate with a degree of autonomy. Most countries do not have those three things.
I think the takeaway for our listeners in the US or Europe is that the standard way of doing things isn't always the best way. We often assume that critical services must be centralized and government run to be effective. Israel's patchwork system proves that a decentralized, competitive, and community-driven model can actually produce better outcomes in some cases.
It is about the first responder, the person who is already there. If we can empower the person who is already there with the right tools and the right information, we don't need to wait for the big truck to arrive from the station across town.
But we should be clear about the trade-offs. This system relies on a level of social cohesion and shared purpose that is quite rare. It also creates a two-tier system in some ways, where the quality of your care might depend on how many volunteers live in your specific zip code. In the periphery, the response times are still longer. The ambucycle model works best in high-density urban areas like Tel Aviv or Bnei Brak. In the desert of the Negev, you still need that centralized state-funded ambulance station because there aren't enough volunteers to create a dense enough network.
So it is a hybrid. The centralized state provides the backbone, and the decentralized volunteers provide the speed and the nuance in the cities. It is a fascinating model of public-private philanthropic partnership. And we have to give credit to the volunteers. These are 7,000 people who are willing to drop everything, their dinner, their sleep, their work, to run toward a crisis.
There is a psychological toll to that, especially in a country where those crises are often violent. We saw that after October 7th. The mental health of these first responders became a major national issue. When you are a volunteer and you see the things they saw, you do not have the same institutional support system that a full-time police officer or soldier might have.
Or at least you didn't, until these organizations started building their own trauma and resilience units. Again, funded by the diaspora. It is a complete ecosystem. From the motorcycle to the medical kit to the therapist who helps you process the trauma after the call. It is all part of this parallel infrastructure.
It makes me wonder if this is the future for other countries facing budget constraints. Could we see a united Hatzalah of London or a united Hatzalah of New York?
There are actually Hatzalah chapters in many major cities around the world, but they usually serve the local Jewish community. The difference in Israel is that it is a national service for everyone. Expanding that to a broader secular population requires a level of volunteer commitment that most modern cities struggle to maintain. It is a question of social capital. Do you trust your neighbor to show up with a defibrillator? Does your neighbor feel a moral obligation to do so?
In Israel, the answer is a resounding yes. In a more atomized society, that might be a harder sell, but the technological part is definitely exportable. The GPS-based dispatch of nearby trained civilians is something that could be integrated into any city's emergency response. We already have things like the Pulse Point app in the US, which alerts CPR-trained citizens to nearby cardiac arrests. It is the same logic, just on a smaller scale.
It is the life compass idea, but for everyone. If I am in a mall and someone collapses and I know how to use an AED, I want my phone to tell me. I do not want to wait for the security guard to find it. It is about removing the friction between the need and the resource.
We have covered a lot of ground here, from the history of MDA to the tech of Hatzalah and the heavy reality of Zaka. The main takeaway for me is that the unusual patchwork Daniel mentioned is not a sign of a broken system. It is a sign of a resilient one. It is a system that is adapted to the specific challenges of its environment, traffic, terror, and a deeply involved global community.
It is a lesson in agility. In a world that is becoming more volatile, the ability to activate a decentralized network of volunteers is a massive strategic advantage. It is something we should be looking at very closely as we think about civil defense in the 21st century.
If you want to dive deeper into the physical side of this resilience, check out episode 1163, where we discussed Israel's civil defense crisis and the infrastructure of bunkers. It really puts the human response we talked about today into context.
This has been a great exploration. It is one of those topics where the more you look, the more you see how interconnected everything is. Faith, technology, and global politics all converging on a single street corner in Jerusalem.
Thanks for joining us today. This has been My Weird Prompts. A huge thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the wheels on this thing. And a big thanks to Madal for providing the GPU credits that power our research and generation pipeline.
We will be back soon with another deep dive. If you enjoyed this episode, a quick review on your favorite podcast app goes a long way in helping other people find the show.
You could also find us on Telegram by searching for My Weird Prompts to get notified the second a new episode drops.
Until next time,
see ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from slow.